So what are limitations? Well, first off, I find that most universities like to have the limitations found after the scope of the study as far as their sections or headings in your chapter 1. This is usually near the latter third of the chapter itself. Some universities may require it somewhere else. You may have to also address it in chapter 3 and chapter 5, but when we're talking about it in chapter 1, this is where I find it most frequently. Limitations are really the natural or perhaps the inherent limitations that anyone would expect to find who is doing the research that you're going to do. For example, if you are going to do a quantitative correlation study, the limitations that you are going to have to deal with for the most part would be the exact same ones somebody else will have to deal with when they are doing their research with the same research method and design. Same as if you're doing a qualitative phenomenological study. Some of the limitations would be the same that other people would experience as well because they are inherent or they're natural within that type of research method and design. As I mentioned, I'll give you several different examples and go into this more in depth. What could cause the data to be in error? Consider your own ideas on what you're going to do with your research. Let's say you're going to do a survey, and it's a Likert type survey, and you're going to send it out to 500 people in an organization. What could cause the data to be in error? Well, they have situations where people just, if there's 5 items to pick from, they don't want to do the survey, they just do fill in number 3 from top to bottom so they can get out of it. Or they create that Christmas tree, or they create a zigzag. They don't even read the questions. We know this happens because it happens often in research when people are doing Likert type surveys. That could cause your data to be in error. Now, let's just say, for example, you're going to do a qualitative case study and you're going to be interviewing several different stakeholders in a natal intensive care unit in a hospital. And you're going to interview several doctors and several nurses, several staff people. What could cause the data to be in error? Well, sometimes when you interview people, they don't want to tell the truth because they're afraid that somebody's going to find what they said. Even though they're signing a consent form and you're guaranteeing confidentiality, some people will not always be truthful, particularly if you're asking about some situation that didn't go well and it was their fault or they contributed to it or they don't want to tell on somebody else whose fault it was. So there are many reasons why data can be an error. And in limitations, that's what we're asking for. What are the potential reasons why the data may not come back truthful or as exact as it could be otherwise? Relate to one's natural tendencies. And what I mean by this is, let's just say you are doing research, much like I did, and it's on people who use a corporate fitness center. And you want to find out if they're more efficient and effective in their work or if they have less sick days. Well, some people, because they go to the fitness center, they can't perceive themselves as being less healthy because one would think if you're using a fitness center, you should be more healthy. But we also know that's not the case. So one's own natural tendencies might be to not tell the truth because they don't want to look bad in somebody else's eyes, or they're not even able to see within themselves that they've been going to use this fitness center and are in fact in less shape because they've been eating poorly and they really haven't been using the fitness center to its fullest impact upon them. Limitations, they're related to the research method and design as well as many other things, but in particular, as I mentioned with the example of the quantitative or qualitative examples, that there are some natural or inherent limitations with every research method and design. It doesn't matter which one you choose, and you're not going to be able to overcome them all, nor do you have to list every one of them. But what we would be looking for in your proposal or dissertation in this section is that you have given consideration to what might be the most critical ones related to your study and the application perhaps where you're applying your study. Limitations can also be related to a situation. Different types of situations will have inherent limitations. Let's just take, for example, there was 5 people and they saw an accident. that situation happens so quickly. And because each person may have his or her own filters and recall capabilities, you may get several different stories of what happened in that accident because each person perceived it differently. Now, here's a limitation that's just natural, it's inherent, there's nothing we can do about it. But the idea, perhaps, about doing a case study is you would ask several different people what happened, and therefore you would take the common themes amongst all of them to kind of suggest what occurred. The limitation section of a proposal is the opportunity for the reader to be able to gain a better understanding about how you, when you write your work, are applying discerning critical thinking skills. By looking at the situation, by looking at the research methods, and writing some of the limitations that could impact your work, or if the dissertation done did impact your work, this allows the reader to be able to gain a sense of what you considered, what you thought about, and how you decided to consider that in the work that you did. This is an important section. I think a lot of students don't spend enough time in this limitation. They think it's very simple, but it's really a critical point, particularly considering should somebody later, after your dissertation is done, decide to use your study as a basis or to extend your research. If the limitations are not taken into account well enough, somebody else may do research in a manner that's not going to serve them well. Ideally, I find one limitation or two if they're related per paragraph. Now, some of my mentees have had one paragraph for the entire section of limitations. Some have had 3 or 4 paragraphs. Each dissertation is going to be unique, but I do suggest that you consider at least whether the limitations relate to your research method and design and anything that's involved related to a situation. Limitations are subjective to the researcher and as well as the reviewer. What may be a limitation in my mind may not be one in yours or somebody else's. Same as you might see a limitation, but your dissertation chair doesn't understand it well enough. This is important. This is the reason why we are able to see the discerning critical thinking that a student has, because not only do we put what the limitations are, we explain the rationale. And that's why I ask for full paragraphs for each one, or maybe 2 if they're considered related to one another. But if you can indicate what the limitation is and the rationale for why you see it as a limitation, then your work becomes very powerful. And it's okay that somebody else might see it differently. It doesn't matter. And matter of fact, you may find questions about this in your oral defense later, because somebody asks you, did you consider a certain limitation? And then you would be able to say yes or no based on whatever occurred and your rationale for why it was yes or no. When you reflect your knowledge of the limitations, you are also reflecting a certain knowledge of the research method and design. Most doctoral chairs and committee members will tell their students, once you have chosen your research method and design, that you really need to become an expert at those. You need to become an expert because you're going to have to know all the intricacies, these limitations, as well as how to apply that research method and design to its fullest capability to be able to get the data that you want to collect and make sure it's accurate, that's going to reflect upon the central problem of your work. Here, when you write the limitations well, the reviewer, the other person, gets to see to what degree you are actually a consumer research and also understand research that you're doing. You'll find that the deeper you get into your own dissertation work, the more you will find errors in other people's work because you're becoming more of an expert. And it's not uncommon to read research studies and other people's work with errors and mistakes in them, even in peer-reviewed work, even in dissertation work that's published. So it's not about what's right or wrong, it's about you in this situation being fully aware of what you're doing with your own work to the best of your capabilities. Limitations: if in a new area, not much supporting literature may be available. There may not be much to support the research method and design limitations. There may not be much information out there on a new topic that somebody's looking at for the very first time to even understand what the limitations are, because it's such a conceptual view at the point of the research. So it's not as important to be able to articulate 2 or 3 paragraphs if only one is needed, or if there's limited information to suggest what the limitations are. It's not uncommon that when you write your proposal that you provide few limitations, but later, after you have done the research, you go back into chapter 1 as you're finalizing the whole dissertation and do some different work in this section, because by the time you're done with your research, you will have lived through the process. You will have then perhaps dealt with several limitations that you didn't expect when you made your proposal, and that's fine, and that's as it should be. Also, it reflects the author knows what can adversely influence the study. Again, this is the opportunity for those discerning critical thoughts and for the author of the study, you, to be able to reflect that you have looked at what could potentially impact your study in a negative way and have been able to articulate that rationale. It's not uncommon, as I mentioned, that when you do your dissertation, this section will change because then you have lived through it, and therefore your reflections might be different as well. In the dissertation itself, when you're writing that piece after you've added chapters 4 and 5, you may go back into this area and address for future studies based on the found limitations, meaning that when you make a recommendation in chapter 5, you may need to go back and say the recommendation is based on certain limitations of your study that perhaps if they weren't there might garner different types of data, therefore to get different types of information. Perhaps if one is going to extend a study, if somebody's going to extend your study or look at an area that you recommend for future research to be done, they might want to find what your limitations were of your study or what you believe limitations, so when they do it, they can perhaps at least counter them as they go through their work, perhaps more so than you were able to. I'm going to share several different types of limitations that, in this case, are possible people concerns that may cause your data to be incorrect, and therefore natural inherent limitations of your study. People just may not be truthful. As much as you would like to believe that everybody you're going to interview or everybody who does a survey for you is going to tell the truth, they may not. And they may have many reasons for that. Again, they may fear giving answers that somebody else is not going to agree with. They may not have the time. They may not care. Somebody might just want to mess with your research. So this is nothing against you personally, and you shouldn't take it personally. It is what it is. People may fear that retribution. Once the data is out, once it's published, once the leader of an organization reads what's going on in that dissertation that you published, they may then go back to the people. For example, let's just say it was in the NICU, the Natal Intensive Care Unit. The manager of that unit or the director of nursing may then decide that she or he did not like what was going on and found from the data problems, and there may be this fear of retribution, so therefore you didn't get all the correct answers that you had hoped for. Some people may just be in a hurry. If you have a long survey, this is just inherent. The longer your survey, the less you can expect people to give their full attention to that. I have a survey that goes with my book called The Laws of Communication, a survey that's called the Supervisor Leadership Communication Inventory. It started out at well over 70 questions. Now it's about 60 questions. And I find that if the survey is too long, after a certain point of time, perhaps after a minute, maybe 90 seconds, people get bored and they just want to rush through it and get it done. So as you craft your interview questions or survey questions that might go in a Likert type survey, you want to be aware of this, that if you have too many questions, people may be in a hurry and may not give you truthful answers. May not be able to self-reflect. That's not correct replies. What this means is that example of the person who is in an organization and there's a problem and you're asking questions about the problem and they don't want to tell the truth. They can't see that it was their fault. Or if it's the person who uses a corporate fitness center and they ended up actually gaining weight and being in worse health because of other things they were doing, they may not be able to self-reflect and say that they themselves are problematic and it's been their own cause. They'll blame it on the equipment not working. They'll blame it on the fitness center not open the hours that they want it. They'll have all these different reasons, but they will not be able to give the right answer because they can't see it within themselves. It's not up to us to judge people and their responses. We just have to take at face value that people are going to do their replies and answers correctly and to the best of their knowledge. But we have to realize that a limitation is that that may not be true. Some people may have a personal agenda. Let's say, for example, somebody was being interviewed about what happened in the NICU during that case study that you're working on. And somebody may have a personal agenda that they want to make sure that the manager of that unit gets fired. They don't like that person because they got a bad evaluation. That may change or daunt or put a shadow over his or her responses to the questions that you ask them. So we have to keep in mind that while we would hope that people wouldn't do this, it's not as uncommon as you would think it is to find people who have a personal agenda and they'll do anything they can to make sure that something that they want gets done. Some people may not understand all the questions and therefore they're putting responses in that they don't really understand. I found this to be true when I first created the survey titled Supervisor Leadership and Communication Inventory when I went overseas with its first application, and some people didn't understand some of the phrasing of some of the questions because it did include some American slang or trite sayings that other people in other countries didn't understand. So that was a very good lesson for me to learn. Even though I knew some of these limitations, sometimes it's difficult to see in our own work until after we do the research the first time, which may be your case in your dissertation. Of course, that's why we try to do the pilot studies to be able to help change anything that needs to be revised before you actually do the survey with the survey population. But it's not uncommon that some people may not understand all the questions if they don't speak the same language, perhaps English as a second language if you're doing this in the United States, or if you're doing it overseas where people may not understand English to the same level as other people might. Here are some of the possible research method and design concerns. We can't prove anything from a sample. So if I was going to do a survey of 400 people in a company that has 1,500 people in it, I can't prove anything because I'm only getting a sample size. I can only suggest what that data refers to. If I'm going to interview only some of the people who are in the natal intensive care unit at the hospital, I can't prove anything because I'm not asking everybody the same question. So we talk often about data and what it suggests, on what it might represent. We don't talk about data proving anything because data rarely proves anything. There are some instances where it can, but in most instances, particularly doctoral dissertation research and many of the research articles that you've seen, the correct way that people refer to the data is that it suggests. When you start to hear or read about how researchers prove something, that may be something that you think of as that consumer research that says, wait a minute, I need to find out what they're talking about because they may be using the words incorrectly. The survey instrument may not be correct. You may not have the exact instrument for the tool that you really should have to use to do the research. For example, some people will want to borrow or use somebody else's survey that's already been tested for reliability and validity. If the tool works, that's fine. But if it's not the right tool, you may actually do research using the wrong tool. Therefore, you're going to get the wrong data. If it's not the right tool, it will give you wrong data. We just need to be sure that we consider a limitation when we're having a survey. Even if we create our own interview questions for perhaps interviewing people about their lived experiences for a phenomenological study, we may still not have asked the right questions. We may have asked good questions, but we may not have asked all the right questions. So limitation of a survey instrument, whether it be interview questions or a Likert type survey, may be that it's not as accurate as it should have been. We have to remember that different people see things differently. And because of that, that's why we may have the outcome of our questions in such a way that it doesn't give us the data we want. So we look at our survey instrument or our questions that we may ask people and realize that somebody may have a different perception of what's being asked of them as compared to what is being asked of them. That's why when we have open-ended questions, we want to have them semi-structured so when people provide an answer, we can have follow-on questions and ask for greater clarification of what they said and what they may have referred to. In a Likert type survey, it's not as easy to do that, but because somebody may see it one way, they may actually put the questions incorrectly answered as they would otherwise. Questions could be vaguely written. This could be survey questions or it could be interview questions. Depending on what kind of questions you have, that's one of the reasons, of course, we want to do a pilot test, is to have a couple of those people who are of the survey population take a look at the questions and see if they make sense. We can help reduce this problem here of the questions vaguely written by doing that pilot. But it is a limitation. It doesn't say anything about you and your study and your work. It's just that if you're going to create your own survey, as I did for my doctoral dissertation research, that I had to realize that this was a limitation towards my work because I created the survey myself. You have human biases, and the biases that go with those who either create the survey questions or the interview questions, as well as those who are answering them, has a limitation that we just need to consider. If you happen to be a female and you have not been promoted and you're doing a dissertation about how women have not been promoted or something that deals with the glass ceiling, you may have some bias. It doesn't mean that you can't do the study. It just means that what we're doing here is we're telling other people that there may be a potential bias. If I was going to do work in a corporate fitness center, another study, I would find a certain level of bias because I've been dealing with that for so many years as both a leader in an organization, a user of fitness centers, and also my personal health, that I have a bias on that, thinking that whoever goes in there should be in better shape when they walk out the door. I mean, how could they not? But yet it happens all the time. And so all we're asking here for in these limitations is to let the reader know that we've considered these limitations. It doesn't stop us from doing the study. It just says that we consider them. Now what I want to do is share some examples from some of my mentees who have went through their dissertation research and successfully graduated. In most cases, my mentees have finished their proposal and their dissertation reviews at the university level on the first review. Now, this has more to do with them than it does with me, but my guidance as the dissertation chair has been consistent with every one that I've done, where we've worked on one heading at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time. And I believe that is the strong point of what I call as incremental gains, as small steps add up over periods of time equals, in this case, a proposal approval or a dissertation approval. Each of the examples that you see from my mentees are given to me with their permission. They own the copyright. I'm just using it here as part of brain tithing, as I am doing, sharing my insights and information with you to be able to contribute something that might help you, as well as we hope that you will do to help others once you earn your degree. The first example is from Dr. Maria Aponte. Selling, the lived experiences of domestic property and casualty insurance leaders is the title of her doctoral dissertation. In her limitations, she started out by giving a little information about what limitations actually are. Cooper and Schindler, 2011, posited that limitations exist in research studies. Limitations are defined as potential problems or weaknesses the researcher identifies within the study. Limitations may address problems in data collection, unanswered questions by participants, or better selection of purposeful sampling of individuals or sites for the study. She led in her section with a little information, helping the reader to gain a sense that she knows what limitations are. So as a reader of her work, I sense that there's a certain level of expertise that she has, and therefore I'm going to probably give her a little bit more credibility in my thought based on what I'm reading here. She goes on to say the research questions might not have been related to previous research about selling. Selling of insurance in Puerto Rico is almost unexplored. No previous literature that specifically addresses the phenomena of selling in the insurance business for comparison exists. The findings of the current study support future research in that particular sector of the financial services industry. So what she has indicated is because there's a lack of research that she was able to find in Puerto Rico about the same topic she's doing, is that a limitation could be that this is the first one. There's no other strong theoretical frameworks to support what she's doing, or even conceptual frameworks, as well as research questions that she could actually use for her study, or interview questions that she may have borrowed from somebody else. In example number 2 by Dr. Ellen Beatty, her dissertation is titled A Quantitative Correlational Study, Institutional Characteristics and Endowment Investment Performance Following the 2008-2009 Financial Crisis. She, in her work, opens the first paragraph, limitations set the parameters to a research study. The current study was limited to higher education institutions located in the United States that participated in the 2010 National Association of College and University Business Officers Common Fund Study Endowments. This might have limited the generability of the results to larger populations of the United States institutions of higher education. So what she's saying here is, much like we have found in earlier parts of the proposal, even in Chapter 1, it was alluded to in the purpose statement who the survey population was, what the unit of analysis was, if you will, and the location. Here we have to articulate yet again that it's a limitation, that by doing it only in this specific area of only those institutions that participated in the 2010 National Association of College and University Business Officers Common Fund Study Endowments, that it's a limitation because some universities may not have participated in that study of endowments. So we start to see that in the limitations, we can see these boundaries, if you want, or she called them parameters. The time frame of the study was another limitation. The influence of the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 to the fiscal year 2010's endowments investment performance was the focus of the study, limiting the time frame of data collection and analysis to the years 2009 and 10. So what she is saying, that she has looked specifically at those years. So she didn't consider much before 2008 or anything after 2010. So as we start to see in her work, as in others, the limitations are literally brought out in words. That's good. I like that. I like it when somebody says limitations of this study are, much like we did in the purpose statement. The purpose of this research study is to be very specific, again, succinct. Dr. Joe Hagee, in the next example, his dissertation is titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study. Dr. Hagee goes on in his work to suggest this study was limited by the number of participants who completed the survey. The study was limited to participants who agreed to participate voluntarily. So it's not like he made people do this. So that's a limitation. Not everybody was involved, and only the people who volunteered were part of the survey. Although this study used validated survey instruments, the participants might have had difficulties interpreting the survey questions. It's because he was doing this in a country outside the United States where the surveys were actually created by people in the United States. Again, sometimes when people do surveys, they may not fully understand every word or the context of every word in a survey. Dr. Hagee went on to indicate that the reliability of data was limited to self-reported feedback, honesty, social desirability, and recollections of the survey participants. Self-rating bias was likely, as individuals tend to exaggerate their expertise and character. This is very true, because sometimes people exaggerate when they start talking about themselves, how much they know or how good they are. So again, that's another inherent limitation of collecting data. Dr. Hagee went on to say the surveys used in this study represented a snapshot of one-time data measurements, that he didn't take into account doing this on several different indications along the way. It's just that snapshot of time like most research is. It's what happened in the situation that people are being asked about. The biases of participants may be limiting to this study by not being representative of the population. Participants had the option to either participate or not participate. So if a lot of people decide not to participate, you could see where he's got certain biases because he doesn't have perhaps everybody or enough people who have very different views on what's going on in his research topic. So what we're seeing here are several of my mentees who have given several indications of both research and personal limitations. I have two more examples, and one I want to share from Dr. Patricia Schroeder. She did a quantitative correlation study of individualism, collectivism, and employee innovation in Turkey. A second limitation that she indicated of the study was that the location of the study and sample size. The locations were selected as they offered the potential of participations from different regions in Turkey. Here it is a specific situation in Turkey, so therefore the limitation has something to do with the location of her study. The research study was not longitudinal based, so the limitation of findings represent one point in time was expected. So what she is saying, much like Dr. Hagee is, this is just one survey, one time to see what's going on. Perhaps doing the same research a year from now, and then 2 years from now, and 3 years from now will show some trend data, and you may have more reliable outcomes, but that's not possible in a doctoral dissertation because you're, in most cases, looking at a point in time. Now, Dr. Susan Krysteniak, in her dissertation titled Exploring the Experiences of Complementary Therapy Nurses, a qualitative phenomenological study, shared this in her Chapter 1. This is in the dissertation once the research is completed, and she wrote, limitations to the study are related to the qualitative nature of hermeneutical analysis. The process relies on possibility of an interpreter bias that is based on culture and transformational based concepts. The conditions under which the interviews occur could present limitations in the study. She didn't say they would or that they did. She's just saying that these are limitations that could have happened, and therefore she's writing to them in case somebody wanted to learn, did she take that into account or not? And that's really all we're asking in limitations, is that you take into account what are some of the limitations that could impact the outcome of the data you collect to produce the information from the data that you're going to report in Chapter 5. Dr. Krysteniak went on to indicate the timing of interviews could be affected by the participant's personal level of stress or any environmental psychological factors that could impact the responses to questions and further discussion. Nurses have a tendency to be stressed out. They go through a lot of burnout because they're being taxed a lot because they don't have many or as many people in the profession as there should be to be able to serve. So if they're in a feeling of stress, that might indicate that some of their answers may not be truthful. And all she is indicating here that that's a potential and as a limitation had to be considered. The convenient sample was not randomized, and therefore the outcome data can only be suggested to the general population and not necessarily applied. Because she didn't do a random sampling, and if you're not familiar with random sampling, then that's something you'll learn in your research courses, but she did more of a convenience where she went to people she knew. And so therefore, it's not like there were 100 people that she could have picked from and she put all their names into a randomizer and picked out the 20 that she was going to interview. She went with people she knew. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that because she did it one way, again, this is a limitation of research that's inherent when you don't do a random sampling, that this outcome could be tainted. Doesn't say that it is, and they're not suggesting it is. Even in your own work, we're not going to suggest that anything that's a limitation is a bad thing. It's just inherent, and it's okay. Of the study for Chapter 1 of the doctoral proposal and doctoral dissertation.